My name is Layla, and I was 19 when my life began to change. My world had always been simple, the quiet streets of a small town shaping my days. But deep inside me, a fire burned. A fire for freedom, for love, for passion. That's when I met Evan. He was 7 years older than me. In the heart of the city, he owned a small cafe, a place filled with laughter and the smell of fresh coffee. The first time I walked in, he handed me a cup and said with a smile, "There's a story in your eyes. Will you tell it someday?" From that moment on, I kept going back. We talked, we laughed, and I felt as though I had stepped into a film. There was something magnetic in his gaze, something mysterious, and I wanted to discover it. Soon, I realized he was becoming my first love. But it wasn't easy. The town whispered, "He's too old for her, he already has his own life, she's just a girl." I heard it all, yet my heart refused to listen. One rainy night, I stayed at the cafe after the customers had gone. The windows fogged with raindrops, the lights dimmed low. Evan poured me a cup of hot chocolate and said, "Lila, sometimes the heart makes choices the mind doesn't agree with. But those choices are the ones that change everything." His words made my heart race. I lowered my eyes, but he stepped closer. I felt his warmth, his presence, his breath. In that moment, I realized desire wasn't just something from stories. It was real, and it was stronger than I had ever imagined. That night, we opened our hearts to each other. There were no promises, only moments. But those moments became the most precious of my life. Yet, happiness always comes with a test. My family stood against us, friends turned away. I felt the weight of loneliness pressing on me, except for him. Evan looked into my eyes and said, "Love is never easy. But if it's real, no amount of opposition can destroy it." And so I made my choice. I would build my life on my own terms, choose my own happiness, no matter what the world said. Lila never imagined that a single step into a small cafe would alter the rhythm of her life. She had walked down that street a dozen times before, never once noticing the wooden sign hanging slightly crooked above the door. That evening, though, the scent of roasted coffee beans floated out onto the pavement, mingling with the cool air and tugging her inside. She pushed open the door and was greeted by the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of porcelain cups, and the soft glow of golden lamps. The place was warm, almost too warm compared to the chill outside, and she hesitated for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the new world she had stepped into. Behind the counter, Evan stood with the ease of someone who belonged there completely. His movements were steady, practiced, yet unhurried. There was something about the way he wiped the steam from a cup before placing it on the shelf that made her watch longer than she meant to. He noticed her standing uncertainly by the door and lifted his head. His smile wasn't forced or rehearsed. It was as if he had been expecting her all along. With a small gesture, he invited her closer. Layla's feet carried her forward even as her mind whispered that she didn't need coffee, that she had only been out for a short walk. Still, she found herself at the counter. He asked her what she would like, his voice deep but gentle, a contrast to the sharp edges of the world outside. She muttered something about not knowing much about coffee, and he chuckled softly, selecting a blend without asking further. When he handed her the cup, their fingers brushed for a second, and she felt a surprising spark run through her. "You have a story in your eyes," he said, almost casually, but his gaze held hers as if he were searching for something beyond the surface. "Will you tell it someday?" Lila was taken aback. No one had spoken to her like that before, like her presence was more than a passing detail. She laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the words had already planted themselves deep within her. She carried the cup to a corner table and sat down, her heartbeat unsteady. As she sipped, she watched him work, greeting customers, smiling politely, yet every so often glancing back at her, as though she were still the only one in the room. The cafe around her seemed to fade. The conversations of others became background noise, the ticking clock on the wall distant and irrelevant. All that remained clear was the sound of his voice replaying in her head. She realized she wanted to come back, not for the coffee, not even for the comfort of the cafe, but for the strange, magnetic pull of the man behind the counter. Something had shifted. She couldn't name it yet, but she felt it. The beginning of something she wouldn't be able to ignore. Days turned into weeks, and Leela found herself returning to the cafe again and again, each visit cloaked in an excuse she didn't quite believe herself. Sometimes she told her mother she needed a quiet place to study. Other times she claimed she had errands in town that happened to end near Evan's cafe. Deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't the coffee that drew her back, nor the warm lamps or quiet corners. It was him. Evan was different from anyone she had ever met. He spoke with an ease that seemed to melt the walls around her. When he laughed, it wasn't loud or careless but low and unguarded, as though it was meant just for her. At first, their conversations were simple, small talk about the weather, the book she carried with her, the music playing softly from the cafe speakers. But soon, those exchanges deepened. He asked about her dreams, her fears, the places she longed to see, and the people she held close. And unlike others, he didn't just listen for the sake of replying. He listened as though every word mattered. Leela felt her guard slipping each time she sat across from him. She noticed how he leaned in when she spoke, how he paused in his work if she seemed lost in thought, how his eyes softened when she laughed. He had a way of making her feel seen, not just as a girl passing through his cafe, but as someone worth knowing, worth understanding. There were moments when his gaze lingered a second too long, moments when silence stretched between them, filled with an unspoken tension neither dared to name. The pull of attraction was quiet at first, like the gentle current of a river. But it grew stronger with each encounter. She caught herself watching his hands as he worked, noticing the strength in them, the steadiness. She found herself listening for his footsteps behind the counter, the rhythm of his movements somehow reassuring. The air between them grew charged, and though neither spoke of it, both felt it, an invisible thread tightening every time their paths crossed. Yet with that attraction came confusion. Leela was young, still learning who she was, still shaping her future, while Evan was older, grounded, and steady in a way she had never known. He had lived more, seen more, and sometimes that difference frightened her. But instead of pushing her away, it pulled her closer. He was a mystery she wanted to unravel, a world she wanted to step into even if it meant losing herself along the way. Every time she left the cafe, she promised herself she would not return the next day. But by evening, her resolve crumbled. She would find herself walking past the crooked wooden sign, her pulse quickening with the knowledge that he would be there, waiting, as though he had known she couldn't stay away. And each time, when their eyes met, the space between them grew smaller, the pull more impossible to resist. The whispers began softly, like the rustling of leaves carried by the wind. At first, Layla barely noticed them, but over time they grew louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. The small town where she had lived her whole life was a place where every action was seen, every glance observed, and every choice measured against unwritten rules. People talked, and when they saw her spending more and more time in Evan's cafe, they found reasons to dissect it. Her friends were the first to raise their eyebrows. They asked playful questions at the start, teasing her about why she always smelled faintly of coffee beans, or why she suddenly knew the schedule of a man she had only just met. Their teasing soon turned to warnings. "He's too old, Lila," one of them said, her voice heavy with judgment disguised as concern. "He's lived his life already. What could you possibly have in common with him?" Another friend added, "You'll regret it. You think it's romance, but it's a mistake waiting to happen." The words stung, not because they might have been true, but because they carried the weight of disapproval, of separation. She started to feel the invisible line forming between her and the people she had once trusted. Her family's reaction was harsher still. Her mother, noticing her frequent absences and the glow in her eyes that hadn't been there before, demanded answers. When Layla finally confessed that she was spending time with Evan, the look on her mother's face was not shock, it was disappointment, a kind of sorrow that made Layla feel as though she had done something unforgivable. "He's a man with responsibilities, not a boy your age," her mother said, her voice breaking. "He'll control you, he'll hurt you, and by the time you realize it, it will be too late." Layla tried to argue, tried to explain that Evan wasn't like that he listened to her, that he valued her in ways no one else ever had. But the more she defended him, the more her mother shook her head, as if Lila was too naive to see the truth. Even strangers began to notice. Walking through town she felt the weight of eyes on her, the murmurs just loud enough to catch. "That's her. The girl with the cafe owner. Doesn't she know better?" The judgment hung in the air like smoke, seeping into her clothes, her skin, her very thoughts. She began to question herself in quiet moments. Was she blinded by something fleeting? Was she wrong to feel what she felt? Yet, despite the voices, despite the growing distance between her and the world she once knew, her heart refused to let go. Every word spoken against them only deepened her desire to return to the one place where she didn't feel judged, the cafe, where Evan's eyes held no condemnation, only warmth. The louder the world became in its disapproval, the more certain she became that what drew her to him was real, even if she couldn't explain it, even if no one else believed. The night it happened, the rain fell harder than Lila had ever seen, pouring in sheets that blurred the streets and turned the world outside into a haze of silver and gray. The cafe, usually buzzing with customers, was nearly empty. One by one, the regulars slipped out, their umbrellas opening like dark flowers as they disappeared into the storm. By closing time, only she remained, sitting in her usual corner with a book she hadn't touched for an hour. The storm outside gave her an excuse to linger, but in truth, she didn't want to leave. Evan moved quietly behind the counter, wiping glasses, stacking cups, the low hum of his movements filling the silence. Layla watched him, every gesture deliberate yet unpretentious. He seemed lost in his work, but then his eyes lifted and caught hers, and the air between them changed. He didn't look away this time. He let the moment stretch, heavy and unspoken, until she felt her pulse quicken. When the clock struck closing, he walked over to her table, carrying a steaming cup of hot chocolate instead of the usual coffee. He placed it in front of her, his smile softer than she had ever seen it. "Something sweeter for tonight," he said, his voice low, almost tender. She thanked him, her words faltering, and wrapped her hands around the cup to steady herself. The warmth seeped into her palms, grounding her even as her heart raced out of control. The storm rattled the windows, the glass fogging with condensation, and the cafe seemed to shrink until it was only the two of them enclosed in their own world. Evan sat across from her, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his gaze never wavering. "Lila," he began, his tone careful, as though he were balancing on the edge of something fragile. "Sometimes the heart makes choices the mind doesn't agree with. But those choices, they're the ones that change everything." Her breath caught. She looked down at the cup, then back at him, struggling to find words. She wanted to deny the weight of his meaning, but the truth was already in the room with them, undeniable and electric. The distance between them was unbearable now, a space charged with longing and fear. She lowered her eyes, but when he leaned slightly forward, she could feel his presence, the heat of him, the unspoken invitation in the closeness. The silence deepened until the only sounds were the rain and the beating of her heart. She didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of them, drawn by something beyond thought, beyond reason. All she knew was the sudden closeness, the way his hand brushed hers, the way her breath mingled with his. The world outside disappeared, and there was no storm, no whispers, no judgment, only the two of them suspended in a moment that felt stolen from time itself. It wasn't grand or orchestrated, but it was real, raw and irreversible. In that small cafe, with the rain pressing hard against the glass, they crossed a line neither of them could step back from, surrendering to the pull that had been growing between them since the very first day. The morning after their first night together, the world no longer felt the same to Leela. The memory of his touch lingered on her skin, the sound of his voice echoed in her mind, and every heartbeat reminded her of the choice she had made. But reality, relentless and unforgiving, was waiting for her outside the safe walls of the cafe. By the time she walked home, whispers had already begun to move through the town like wildfire. It was as though people could sense a shift in her, as though the glow in her eyes betrayed her secret. Her mother confronted her before she could even set her bag down. The conversation was not a gentle one, it was an interrogation. Where had she been? Why had she stayed out so late? Why was she choosing him of all people? Layla tried to defend herself, tried to explain that what she felt with Evan was not some fleeting distraction but something deep, something real. Her mother refused to listen. "You're throwing your life away," she said, her voice sharp with fear disguised as anger. "He will ruin you. Can't you see that?" The words sliced through her like knives, not because she believed them, but because she knew they came from a place of love twisted into judgment. Her father's silence was even harder to bear. He said nothing, just shook his head and left the room, the weight of his disappointment heavier than any scolding could have been. That silence followed her for days, turning the house into a place of quiet hostility. Meals were no longer shared, conversations were clipped, cold, and unfinished. Every time she looked at her parents, she felt like a stranger in her own home. The distance didn't stop there. Her closest friends began to drift away, their laughter no longer welcoming, their eyes filled with unspoken criticism. When she tried to talk to them, they answered with polite restraint, as though she had become someone foreign, someone reckless. One of them finally said it outright, "We can't watch you destroy yourself. If you won't let go of him, then don't expect us to stay." The betrayal cut deep. She had imagined her friends would understand, or at least stand by her, but instead they abandoned her when she needed them most. Walking through town became unbearable. Every street corner felt hostile, every pair of eyes a reminder that she had chosen a path no one approved of. She could hear their voices even when they weren't speaking. "She's foolish. She's lost. She doesn't know what she's doing." The shame wasn't hers, but she carried it anyway, heavy on her shoulders, pressing her down. And yet, amid the coldness of her family, the betrayal of her friends, and the condemnation of strangers, Evan remained her refuge. With him, the weight fell away, if only for a little while. In his presence, she felt seen, understood, and protected. But outside those walls, she bore the crushing reminder that love always comes with a price, and hers was loneliness. The night they finally escaped the walls of the cafe and the watchful eyes of the town, Layla felt as though the air itself had changed. Even had promised to take her somewhere no one would know them, a place where their names carried no history, no gossip, no weight. When they boarded the late train and left the familiar streets behind, she pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and watched the lights of her small world fade into darkness. For the first time in a long while, she felt the possibility of freedom. The coastal city welcomed them with its salty breeze and endless horizon. It was a place that seemed untouched by judgment, where strangers passed without care, and the sea swallowed secrets whole. Even led her down narrow streets lined with pastel houses, their shutters open to let in the warm evening air, and Layla felt as though she had stepped into a dream she hadn't known she was chasing. For once, she wasn't the girl whispered about in the market or scolded at the dinner table. She was simply herself, walking beside a man who made her feel alive. They rented a small apartment near the water, its walls plain, its furniture sparse, but to Layla, it was a palace. She had never had a space that was entirely her own, and now here she was, building something with him, even if it was fragile, even if it was temporary. The mornings began with the sound of gulls calling and sunlight spilling across the sheets, and she would wake to find Evan watching her, his expression soft, almost reverent. He made her coffee just the way she liked it, and she learned how he preferred his eggs, small details that turned their days into a rhythm uniquely theirs. They explored the city hand in hand, wandering through crowded markets, tasting fresh fruit, and listening to street musicians play songs that felt written just for them. No one stared, no one whispered. They were just another couple in love, blending into the flow of strangers who had no reason to care. For Layla, the anonymity was intoxicating. She didn't have to explain herself, didn't have to fight against disapproval. She could laugh freely, touch him without fear, exist without guilt. At night, they sat by the sea, watching the waves crash against the shore, the moonlight turning the water silver. Evan would tell her stories from his past, moments of triumph and regret, while she spoke of dreams she had never dared to share with anyone. In those conversations, she felt the depth of their connection more strongly than ever, as though the world had shrunk to just the two of them. She could imagine a life built here, away from everything and everyone who doubted them. But beneath the beauty of their escape lingered a quiet truth neither of them voiced: this freedom was fragile. The town they left behind still existed, their families still carried disappointment, and whispers had a way of traveling farther than they should. Yet for now, as she leaned against Evan with the sea stretching endlessly before them, Layla let herself believe that love could be enough, that the world could be held at bay by the strength of their devotion. The first cracks appeared not with arguments, but with silence. At first, it was subtle, the kind of quiet that settled between words, unspoken questions hanging in the air. Layla noticed that Evan had begun to withdraw, his eyes distant even when he sat across from her at the breakfast table. He still smiled, still touched her hand, but something in his expression had shifted. When she asked if he was tired, he nodded. When she pressed further, he changed the subject. She wanted to believe it was nothing, but her heart told her otherwise. The tension grew heavier with each passing day. Their small apartment, once filled with laughter and warmth, began to feel smaller, as though the walls were closing in. Layla tried harder to bring the light back, cooking his favorite meals, suggesting walks along the shore, dressing in the red dress he had once admired. But his responses grew increasingly muted. He still loved her, she told herself, but perhaps love was not enough to keep the world from seeping in. It wasn't long before the whispers they had tried to leave behind began to reach them even here. One evening, Evan returned home later than usual, his face clouded. He admitted that someone from their old town had seen them together, and had spoken with his business associates. Rumors were spreading, and his reputation was being questioned. For him, the consequences were tangible, clients hesitating to trust him, colleagues raising doubts. For Layla, it was another reminder that escape was never complete. The outside world was creeping back in, dragging with it the judgment they had fought so hard to escape. This pressure seeped into their relationship. Evan grew frustrated, not at her but at the situation, though sometimes the frustration slipped through in his tone, in his silence, in the heaviness of his sighs. Layla felt guilt she couldn't name, as though her presence had fractured the stable life he once had. She tried to assure him that they could withstand it, that love could endure anything, but the fear in his eyes told her he wasn't sure. In the solitude of her thoughts, doubt began to bloom. She loved him fiercely, but was she strong enough to be the reason his life unraveled? She lay awake at night listening to the sound of his breathing, wondering if he would wake one morning and regret everything. She feared losing him, but she feared even more becoming a burden he could no longer carry. And yet, in those fragile moments, there were still sparks of what had bound them together. A sudden laugh that escaped him during dinner, a soft kiss pressed to her temple before sleep, the way his hand instinctively reached for hers as they crossed the street. These small gestures reminded her that the love between them was real, even if it was being tested by forces beyond their control. The cracks in their sanctuary were undeniable, but so was the fire that had drawn them together. Layla clung to the hope that if they held on tightly enough, if they fought for what they had, the fractures would not break them, but instead reveal how deeply they were willing to endure for love. The night of the storm was unlike anything Layla had ever experienced. The sky cracked open with thunder that shook the very walls of their small apartment, and rain lashed against the windows as though the sea itself wanted to break inside. Power flickered, plunging the rooms into darkness before returning in a dim, trembling glow. She and Evan sat in silence at first, listening to the chaos outside, the storm mirroring the unrest that had already begun to stir within their hearts. It was Evan who finally spoke, his voice low, almost swallowed by the sound of rain. He admitted the fears he had been holding back, the weight of the judgment they carried, the risks he had taken to be with her. His words were raw, stripped of the calm assurance he usually wore. "I don't know how much longer we can live like this," he confessed, and the tremor in his voice made Lila's chest tighten. For a moment, she was afraid it was the beginning of the end, that the storm outside was simply echoing the storm inside their love. But instead of breaking apart, the truth brought them closer. She moved to him, her hands trembling as they reached for his, her voice breaking as she admitted her own fears. The whispers, the isolation, the endless question of whether they had made a mistake. "I don't care what they say," she told him, her words hurried, desperate. "I only care about us." The vulnerability in her voice seemed to unravel something in him. He pulled her into his arms, and in that embrace, all the walls they had built around their doubts crumbled. Lightning illuminated the room in harsh bursts, and in between those flashes of light, they found each other with a depth that felt almost sacred. Their kisses were not gentle, they were fierce, born from the fear of loss and the urgency of love. Every touch carried both desperation and devotion, as though they were clinging to the only thing that anchored them in a world determined to tear them apart. The storm outside grew wilder, but within their four walls, it was as though the chaos fueled their fire, stripping them down to the most honest parts of themselves. Time blurred. They spoke in broken whispers, promises laced with tears, breaths caught between confessions. Evan told her he had never felt love this consuming, this dangerous, yet this necessary. Leela, with her cheek pressed against his chest, confessed that even if it destroyed her, she could not imagine life without him. The storm outside raged, but their voices, their bodies, their closeness created a world where only they existed. By dawn, the rain softened into a steady drizzle, and the first light of morning crept into the room. They lay together, exhausted yet whole, as though the storm had washed away every pretense, every fear, leaving only truth. Layla traced the lines of Evan's hand with her fingertips, memorizing him, as if to remind herself that no matter what awaited them outside, they had faced the storm together and survived. For that night, their love had not just endured. It had been reborn, tempered by fire and rain. As I share this journey with you, I hope you felt not just the moments of love and desire, but the courage it takes to follow your heart even when the world questions you. Life is never simple, and love is never easy. But the beauty lies in those choices we make, the risks we take, and the strength we discover within ourselves. Our hearts will lead us to experiences that shape us, challenge us, and sometimes redefine who we are. Thank you all for listening, for giving your time and attention to this story. It means so much to me to be able to share a piece of this journey with you. I hope it inspires you to embrace your own passions, to stand strong in the face of judgment, and to cherish the connections that make life meaningful. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Your presence here, your willingness to hear this story, is something I will always be grateful for. May we all continue to live with courage, with passion, and with hearts open to the extraordinary moments life offers. Goodbye for now, and may your own stories be filled with love, strength, and unforgettable journeys.